Sweep away my pain, bring your healing to my heart. Help me love once again. Cares and worries get me down. Fear of failure fills my day. When I'm lost and all alone, help me, Lord, to find your way. People knocking at my door, strangers seeking love and care. Never let me turn them down. Teach me gently how to share. Children, come into my life with your laughter and your song. When will I become like them? Teach me, Lord, to sing along.
Hello dear friends, welcome back. Hope you remember what we said in the previous session. We mentioned about the history narrated in the Bible, the history of salvation, which is going through different stages. And now we are going to deal with another point, how to approach the Bible. We are all here to study the Bible. And how to study the Bible, or what all things are we to remember when we study the Bible. Of course, the study of the Bible is very interesting and easy. Sometimes we may think it is very difficult because it is too deep and so on. Of course, Bible is deep, but the messages conveyed are simple, and we can easily grasp these messages for our own sake into our own lives. And when we begin our study on the Bible, especially the historical books of the Bible, we can say the history in the Bible is something very special. If somebody asks one of you, what do you understand by a history or a book of history? What would be your answer? I am sure that you will say, a history or a book of history would mean a history that is narrated or written down with empirical proofs, or a history that can be substantiated with the evidences, let us say scientific evidences or proofs. For example, suppose somebody is writing the history of India. Whatever the author writes should be provable or substantiable. Otherwise, what happens? That history will be containing a lot of legends or mythical elements, we would say. Whatever can be proved empirically, it will make up really the history in its proper sense. And this kind of history usually we call a secular history. It is, we have studied or we study in colleges and so on, the history of India or history of Europe, history of America, all these things will be there. And now we can see in our life, in the case of Bible too, we find we have the history. And what about this history in the Bible? Is it the same as the secular history or something different? And it is a very important question. If we say the history narrated in the Bible is a kind of secular history, we will be put into trouble, because many of the things narrated in the Bible cannot be substantiated with empirical proofs, especially the things narrated, the history narrated in the Old Testament. And then, what do we understand about the history in the Old Testament? We can say the history narrated in the Old Testament is history itself, but not the secular history. We can call it a theologically interpreted history or a theological history. Theologically interpreted history or a theological history. And what does it mean? A natural phenomenon, a historical event that has taken place in space and time, let us say, is interpreted in the light of faith. And when it is interpreted in the light of faith and given a new meaning, we can say it is a theologically interpreted history. To understand this concept, let us take a few examples. We know the child born to David happens to die. We read the story in chapter 12 of 2 Samuel. David was given a punishment for his sins, and one of the punishment given to him was this: the child that is born to you shall die. We know what is the historical nucleus of this story. The newborn child, that is the child born to David in Bathsheba, happened to die on the seventh day. And this death is given a theological interpretation. How? The child died because it is a punishment given by the Lord. Therefore, the natural death of a child is viewed theologically, and it is interpreted in this way. Take another example. The people of Israel entered into the land of Canaan, the promised land. And when Joshua advanced into the land of Canaan, we see there were many important enemy nations which were not conquered by Israel. And the nations, for example, Philistia, Amalek, Edom, where Edomites lived, Moab, where the Moabites lived, Ammon, where the Ammonites lived. Again, in the north of Israel, there was the Syria, or so-called Arameans. All these nations were not conquered by Joshua. And what is the explanation given here? According to the book of Joshua, we read in the beginning of chapter 3, Yahweh did not hand over these mighty nations into the hands of Joshua in order to test Israel, whether they would trust in him or not. Therefore, Joshua was not able to conquer these nations because Yahweh or God did not entrust these nations into his hands. Hence, he could not defeat them. It was not the will of God for Joshua. But now let us think. Why actually Joshua could not go against these nations and defeat them? The important reason is this. Okay, when we go through the narrative about the Exodus, we find the people under the leadership of Moses came away from Egypt, and they did not go through the land of Philistines because Philistines were a mighty nation. And why they could not defeat the Philistines and go and occupy the promised land? The reason they could not do that, because they were not equipped for that. They were not powerful for that. The same way, they came to the land of Amalek, asked permission from the Amalekite king to pass through their land. Moses said to the king of Amalek, "Kindly let us pass through your land. We will neither turn to the right nor to the left. We will not trample your vineyards or grain field. We will just walk through your land and go ahead. We will not disturb you at all." And we read, they were not allowed. And Moses could have defeated the people of Amalek easily because he had a huge number of Israelites with him. And then why he was not able to fight with Amalek and defeat them? In the same way, Joshua could not defeat these big nations or mighty nations, but leaving aside these nations, he conquered other small countries and kingdoms. And this is what we read in the book of Joshua. And Joshua finally conquered about 32 or 31 kings or kingdoms. We read the story in chapter 12 of the book of Joshua. A long list of the kings conquered by Joshua is narrated there. But the important countries or kingdoms were not attacked or conquered by Joshua. If Yahweh was with them, and then He could have defeated them. But Yahweh also did not come to help them in this way. And this is the story that has taken place. And historically speaking, what is actually the truth? In Judges chapter 3, we said the story is narrated like this: Yahweh did not entrust these nations into the hands of Joshua. God had some particular plan for that. He wanted to test the people of Israel. This interpretation we call a theological interpretation. That is, we see a theological meaning in the historical event. And what exactly is the historical event, or what is the reality behind the story? Remember, was the people under the leadership of Moses very strong militarily? They were very great in number. A huge number of Israelites were with him, we read. But what about their military strength? If we read through the letters or read between the lines, we can say there is something else implied. We can reflect on a couple of things. Israelites were slaves. Being slaves, they had no weapons. They will not be allowed to carry weapons, either sword or spear or bow and arrows, whatever it be. They will not be able to manufacture them or hold them. If somebody is found with the weapons, they will be executed because they are slaves and they have no right to own the weapons. And that would mean the people of Israel had no weapons of their own when they came away. They came with bare hands. And another thing, since they were slaves, they did not know the warfare, because somebody has to teach them how to fight, how to use the weapons. Since they had no weapons, and since they had no opportunity to learn how to use the weapons, and there were no teachers for it, naturally we can see that the people of Israel who came away with Moses, they were not trained in warfare. And therefore, they would not be ready to go for fighting because they do not know how to fight. They do not know how to use the weapons. That is the second reason. First of all, we said they were slaves. They did not have weapons with them. The second, even if they secured some weapons, they would not be able to use them because they were not trained for it. In other words, we can say there was no trained army for Israel when they came from Egypt to the land of Canaan. Okay, these two reasons must be borne in mind clearly. And there is still another reason that we should bring into our mind, and that is, just think of the age of Moses when he was called by Yahweh to lead the people of Israel. We read the Bible that Moses died at 120 years old, or when he was 120 years. And we also know that they spent about 40 years in the desert. And that would mean Moses was almost 80 when he was entrusted with the task of leading the people of Israel out of Egypt. Even if we give some margin for his age, we have to calculate that he was more than 60 or 70 when he was called. And what does it mean? It has a great implication historically. Remember what happened to Moses when he was born. There was the decree of Emperor Pharaoh that the male children born to Israelites were to be killed. And we know the story. The child Moses was miraculously saved. His own mother floated the child in a basket. And practically that was waterproof basket. And it was made to flow in the river. And Pharaoh's daughter happened to see the basket and the crying child in it. And the rest of the story we know. Moses was saved miraculously. Now, if all the male children born to the slaves, that is Israelites, and all these children were killed at that time, and only Moses was an exemption. There were no many young Israelites with Moses, because many of them would be aged people, or over age we can say, elderly people. The young ones, probably they were not allowed to live, or sometimes in distant places or villages there may have been some. But if we take the mainstream, we can say there were not many males. And that would mean the population, especially the male population that came away out of Egypt with Moses, would have been an elderly generation. I hope you understand this point. And if it was an elderly generation, what is to be said about it? They are not able to fight. Therefore, there are three reasons why Israelites could not go to fight directly with the enemies. They had no weapons, they were not trained in warfare, and besides, they were an elderly generation, especially the male population. And naturally, they will not be ready for fight, because they would be sure of defeat if they go for fight. And hence, what happens? We see Israel was to spend 40 years in the desert. And why the 40 years? Again, 40 years is a historical fact. But if we ask why there was the need of 40 years, the distance could have been covered within 3 months or maximum 6 months. Okay, we read the story. When Moses set out from Egypt, at first he went to the land of Amalek, but they did not allow him to pass through. If they were allowed to pass through Amalek, they would have reached Palestine within 2 or 3 months' time at the most. And then what happens? They are compelled to take a deviation. They went down along the Sinai Peninsula by the side of the Gulf, Sea of Gulf. And then we see they came to Sinai within 6 months' time. And at Sinai, or on Mount Sinai, there was the covenant with God, or God made the covenant with the people of Israel. Moses was the mediator, and they were given the law, especially the 10 Commandments or Decalogue. And all these things took place practically within 6 months' time. And now they are going through the other side of the Sinai Peninsula to the north, and on through the other side, eastern side of the Dead Sea, and finally they would reach the river Jordan, or farther north of the Dead Sea. Okay, now there's a question. Why almost 39 years for the return journey, or the journey to Jordan from Sinai? Normally speaking, it would have been enough for them to take just 6 months or maximum 1 year. But they took almost 39 years more. Altogether 40 years, we read. And what's the reason given or narrated here? And there we see the history narrated here would show that the people of Israel, they spent about 40 years in such a way that God was giving a kind of spiritual formation for them to believe in Yahweh, to accept in the only God Yahweh and believe in Him. A period of formation lasting for 40 years. And then we can also say the people committed sin and God punished them. There are different instances. People who were punished with fire, who were punished with the biting of snakes, and sometimes some were swallowed up by the earth. When the people revolted, murmured against Yahweh, against Moses, and challenged Yahweh, in spite of God's providing them with whatever they needed, food and drink, they continued to rebel against Yahweh, and God punished them. And this is the result, and that is, we can say, the punishment given by Yahweh for the rebellious people was the cause or the reason why they were to live for 40 years here. And what is the outcome of this? No one who came from the land of Egypt was able to enter the land of Canaan, the promised land, except Joshua and Caleb. All others perished. Okay, that's the story narrated here. But here we can see a historical reason here, and that is the historical reason that we have to find, we can give is this. Within the 40 years, 2 generations will come up, 2 new generations, and they can be trained for war, and then they will be able to fight the enemy, and after 40 years they were ready to cross over River Jordan and enter the land of Palestine. Okay, with this point we conclude this session. Thank you.
Loving God, we thank you for the blessing of reading your word together. We ask that these words of life, truth, and hope would continue to impact us in the days ahead. May your love and grace follow each of us, refreshed and blessed by you. Amen.